There is a city that has been burned to the ground and rebuilt, invaded, plagued, bombed, and flooded. A city where heads were mounted on spikes at the gate for hundreds of years, where rivers ran with blood beneath the streets, where kings tortured their enemies in towers that still stand today. A city that has swallowed its own dead so many times that if you dug anywhere beneath its streets, anywhere, you would find bones. That city is London. And most people think they know it, the red buses, the clock tower, the palaces, but that version of London, the postcard version, is a lie they built on top of something far older, far darker, and far stranger than anything the tourists ever see. Today we are going to tear that postcard apart. We are going to go all the way back, 2,000 years back, and walk through every era of this city's history. The conquests, the massacres, the plagues, the fires, the serial killers and the secret tunnels and the wars that nearly finished London for good. This is not a history lesson. This is the story of how one city survived everything the world threw at it and what it had to become to do that. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because this channel is where history stops being boring and starts being what it always was, terrifying, fascinating, and impossible to look away from. Hit that bell so you never miss a video. And before we go any further, drop a comment below. Tell me, what do you already know about London's dark history? Because by the end of this video, I guarantee at least one thing you thought you knew will turn out to be completely wrong. Before London, there was silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind of silence that comes after people have lived somewhere for thousands of years and then simply disappeared. The Thames Valley, the land that would one day become the most powerful city on Earth, was home to tribes we barely have names for. Celtic peoples who built settlements along the river, who farmed the land, who had their own gods and their own rituals and their own idea of what this place meant. We know almost nothing about them, and that is not an accident. The people who came next were very good at erasing what was there before. The Thames itself was different then, wider, shallower, surrounded by marshes and tidal flats that made it one of the most strategically important crossing points in all of Britain, and that crossing point, that specific bend in the river, is exactly why what came next happened where it did. The land had energy to it. The Celts who lived along the Thames believed the river was sacred. They threw valuable objects into it as offerings: swords, shields, helmets, jewelry. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of these objects from the riverbed, objects that were not lost, objects that were placed there deliberately as gifts to something ancient and powerful that lived in the water. That belief that there was something sacred about this particular stretch of river may be the oldest continuous idea in London's history. And then Rome arrived, and sacred rivers stopped mattering very much. In 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion of Britain. 4 legions, roughly 40,000 soldiers, crossed the Channel and began pushing north and west through a land that had never seen anything like them. They reached the Thames, they needed to cross it, and on the northern bank, on 2 low gravel hills rising above the marsh, they built a bridge. That bridge is why London exists. The Romans called the settlement that grew around it Londinium. Within a decade, it was already a bustling trading post. Merchants, soldiers, administrators, slaves flooding in from across the empire. Goods moved through it, money moved through it, power moved through it. And then, 17 years after it was founded, it was destroyed. Her name was Boudicca. She was queen of the Iceni tribe, a Celtic people whose land had been seized by Rome after her husband's death. The Romans had taken everything. They had flogged her. They had assaulted her daughters. They had treated a sovereign queen like property, like an inconvenience to be disposed of. She united the tribes of eastern Britain and marched on Londinium with an army that the Roman historian Tacitus estimated at 230,000. The Roman governor Paulinus made a calculation. He did not have enough troops to defend the city, so he abandoned it. He left the civilians behind, the merchants, the women, the children, anyone who could not keep up with his retreating army, and marched his legions away. Boudicca's forces entered Londinium unopposed. What they did to it has been confirmed by archaeology. A thick layer of red-burnt ash and debris, dating precisely to this period, sits beneath the modern streets of the City of London. Archaeologists call it the Boudiccan destruction horizon. It runs beneath the financial district, beneath the banks and the trading floors, beneath some of the most expensive real estate on the planet. Londinium was not just captured, it was annihilated. Every building burned. Every person who had not escaped was killed. Roman records say 70,000 people died in the 3 cities Boudicca destroyed: Londinium, Camulodunum, and Verulamium. Tacitus says she gave no quarter, no prisoners, no mercy. Boudicca was eventually defeated in a battle somewhere in the Midlands. The exact location is still debated. After the defeat, she took poison rather than be captured. Her burial place has never been found. And on the ash of the city she had destroyed, Rome built Londinium again, bigger, more permanent, more determined than before. They built a forum, the largest north of the Alps. They built a basilica, a governor's palace, bathhouses, temples, and amphitheater. By 100 AD, Londinium had a population of perhaps 60,000 people. It was the capital of Roman Britain and one of the major cities of the Roman world. And under every single one of those buildings, the ash layer remained, the memory of what Boudicca had done, pressed into the ground, permanent. In 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain. It told them, essentially, that Rome could no longer protect them. They were on their own. The legions had been pulled back to defend Rome itself, which was under threat from the Visigoths. Britain was abandoned, and the most Roman city in Britain, Londinium, began to die. Archaeologists have a name for what happened next. They call it the Dark Earth period. When they excavate beneath the modern city and get down to the layers corresponding to the 5th and 6th centuries AD, they find something strange. Not ruins, not destruction, not ash or fire damage or evidence of battle. Just dark, featureless soil. The buildings didn't collapse dramatically. They weren't burned down. They were simply abandoned. The roofs caved in slowly. The walls crumbled over decades. The streets filled with wind-blown dirt and vegetation. The forums and the basilicas and the bathhouses, all of it just quietly disappeared under a blanket of dark earth. The population of Roman Londinium, which had been 60,000, dropped to almost zero. For roughly 200 years, one of the largest cities in the Roman world was essentially uninhabited. We don't know exactly where everyone went. Some were killed in raids, some fled to the countryside, some were absorbed into the incoming Anglo-Saxon tribes who were pushing across Britain from the east, some simply dispersed, scattered into a post-Roman landscape that no longer had cities, no longer had roads maintained, no longer had the infrastructure of empire. The Anglo-Saxons, interestingly, did not move into the ruins of Londinium. They built a new settlement slightly to the west, in an area they called Londinium. Historians believe they may have actively avoided the old Roman city, perhaps because of superstition about the ruins, perhaps because the old buildings were structurally dangerous, perhaps for reasons we simply don't understand. So for centuries, the greatest city Rome had built in Britain sat empty, dark, silent, slowly being swallowed by the earth that had always been there underneath it. In 842 AD, a fleet of Viking longships appeared on the Thames. London, rebuilt, repopulated, re-established as a trading center, was not ready for what came next. The Vikings attacked and destroyed much of the city in what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes simply as a great slaughter. They came back in 851 with 350 ships, 350. The Thames would have been black with them from bank to bank. They wintered in Britain, the first time a Viking army had ever stayed through the cold months rather than retreating to Scandinavia. That was a new kind of threat, not a raid, an occupation. In 865, what the Anglo-Saxons called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force, and its purpose was conquest. Within a few years, it had taken York, destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, and was pushing into Mercia. London fell to Danish Viking control. For years, one of the most important trading cities in Britain was a Viking city, ruled by Viking leaders, living under Viking law. It was Alfred, King of Wessex, later called Alfred the Great, who changed this. After a series of military campaigns that pushed the Vikings back, Alfred retook London in 886, but he made a crucial decision. He did not rebuild Londinium, the old Anglo-Saxon settlement to the west. He moved the population back inside the old Roman walls, back into the abandoned ruins of Londinium. The walls of Londinium, Roman walls built 8 centuries earlier, were still standing, still strong. Alfred recognized them for what they were, the best defensive fortification in Britain. And so London, for the first time in 400 years, moved back inside its Roman skin. The city that would become the greatest metropolis on earth was reborn, behind walls that Rome had built to last forever. On Christmas Day, 1066, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was almost derailed by a catastrophe. The Norman soldiers outside, hearing the loud acclaim from inside the church, assumed a riot had broken out. They set fire to buildings in the surrounding streets. The congregation panicked and fled. William was left nearly alone at the altar, reportedly trembling to complete his coronation. It was, in retrospect, a very fitting beginning for a reign defined by violence, fear, and absolute control. William understood something important about London. A city that large, that wealthy, that stubborn could not simply be conquered and forgotten. It had to be watched, permanently, intimately. So he built a castle. Not just any castle, a tower, square, massive, with walls 15 feet thick at the base, rising 90 feet above the Thames. Positioned not to protect London from outside attack, but to dominate it, to remind everyone inside the city walls that they were being watched, that they were subjects. That resistance was not just feudal but visible. We call it the Tower of London. For the people who lived under its shadow, it had another meaning entirely. Over the next 6 centuries, the tower became the place where England sent the people it most wanted to forget, the people it most feared, and the people it most wanted to make an example of. 2 of Henry VII's wives were executed there. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, the teenage queen who ruled for 9 days before being imprisoned and beheaded. The young princes Edward V and his brother Richard, who disappeared inside the tower in 1483 and were never seen again. Their bones, believed to be theirs, were found inside a staircase wall nearly 2 centuries later. The torture instruments used inside the tower were legendary. The rack, a wooden frame that stretched a person's joints to dislocation and beyond. The scavenger's daughter, a device that compressed the body instead, forcing the knees to the chest until the spine cracked. Thumbscrews, manacles that left prisoners hanging from walls for days. And then, because history contains multitudes, the tower also had animals. Beginning in 1235, when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II sent Henry III a gift of 3 leopards, the tower maintained a menagerie. Lions, a polar bear which was actually allowed to fish in the Thames on a long chain, an elephant, monkeys, a grizzly bear. For 6 centuries, exotic animals from across the known world lived in the heart of London's most notorious prison. The menagerie was finally closed in 1835, and the animals transferred to the newly opened London Zoo. But for hundreds of years, Londoners could pay a small fee to walk past the cells of prisoners and the cages of lions, all in the same building, all in the same afternoon. History, as I said, contains multitudes. In the summer of 1348, a ship docked at an English port carrying something that had already killed millions across Europe. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, spread by fleas on rats, exploding through populations that had no immunity, no understanding of germ theory, and no ability to stop it. By the time it reached London, entire cities on the continent had already lost half their populations, but London had no way of knowing that. London had no way of preparing. The plague entered the city and tore through it with a speed that must have felt supernatural to the people experiencing it. A person could wake up healthy and be dead by nightfall. The symptoms were unmistakable and horrifying. The swollen lymph nodes, black with blood, that gave the disease its name. Fever, delirium, the smell. The city's infrastructure collapsed almost immediately. There were not enough grave diggers, not enough coffins, not enough priests to administer last rites. The dead were carted through the streets in massive piles, taken to hastily dug pits on the outskirts of the city and buried in layers, body on body on body. One of those burial sites at East Smithfield, just outside the old city walls, has been partially excavated by archaeologists. They found the bodies arranged with a terrible kind of order, neat rows carefully placed despite the crisis, suggesting that even in catastrophe, someone was trying to maintain dignity. Each pit was filled and then a new one started, methodical, exhausted, hopeless. Between 1348 and 1350, London lost somewhere between 30 and 60% of its population. Some estimates are higher. The city that had perhaps 80,000 people at the start of the plague may have had fewer than 40,000 by the end. And the plague came back, 1361, 1375, 1390, 1407. It returned again and again for the next 3 centuries, never quite finishing the job it started, never quite disappearing either. The mass burial grounds from these outbreaks are everywhere under modern London. The Crossrail project, the Elizabeth Line, when its engineers were digging the tunnels, they kept finding them. Plague pits beneath Liverpool Street, beneath Charterhouse Square, beneath what is now the financial district. The city built over its dead, literally placed its foundations on them, and moved on. Let's talk about heads. Specifically, let's talk about the heads that were mounted on spikes on London Bridge for roughly 350 years. The practice began after William Wallace, the Scottish rebel later fictionalized in the film Braveheart, was executed in 1305. His head was the first to go up on the bridge, dipped in tar to preserve it, mounted on a spike above the gate at the southern end. After that, it became custom. Traitors, rebels, anyone the crown wanted to make an example of, their heads went on the bridge. At any given time in the Tudor period, there might be 30 or more heads rotting above the Thames. Foreign visitors to London wrote about it with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was simply part of the city's skyline. But heads on a bridge were only the beginning. Henry VII executed an estimated 57,000 people during his reign. That number is disputed by historians, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. He executed 2 of his 6 wives. He executed his closest advisors, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell. He executed Catholics. He executed Protestants. He dissolved the monasteries and executed anyone who resisted. Tower Hill, just outside the Tower of London, was the primary execution ground for high-profile traitors, but the vast majority of executions happened at Tyburn, a location near what is now Marble Arch at the northeast corner of Hyde Park. Public hangings at Tyburn were not somber affairs. They were festivals. Crowds of tens of thousands gathered. Street vendors sold food and drink. People rented seats in grandstands for a better view. The condemned were sometimes cheered, sometimes pelted with rubbish, sometimes both. In 1571, a new structure was built at Tyburn called the Triple Tree, a triangular gallows that could hang 24 people simultaneously. It was used for the next 180 years. The executions were not quick. Hanging in this period did not involve the calculated drop that breaks the neck. It involved a short drop, enough to tighten the rope, but not enough to kill cleanly. Death by slow asphyxiation, sometimes taking 20 minutes or more. Family members of the condemned would sometimes pull on their legs to try to speed it along. This was normal. This was Tuesday afternoon entertainment for the people of London. Men, women, and children watching other men, women, and children die in public by the thousands over the course of centuries. We have sanitized history almost beyond recognition. The Tudor London that people romanticize, the Shakespeare plays, the magnificent palaces, the Elizabethan Golden Age, existed on the same streets where the bodies of executed criminals were left to rot in iron cages at crossroads as warnings. The same streets where people went to watch their neighbors hang as a leisure activity. That is the city Shakespeare wrote in. That is the city Elizabeth walked through, and knowing that changes everything about how you see it. By 1665, London had survived the Black Death so many times that plague was almost considered a routine inconvenience, an accepted part of city life. People who could afford to leave during an outbreak did. People who couldn't stayed and took their chances. The Great Plague of 1665 was different only in scale. It began in the parish of St. Giles-in-the-Fields in the spring of 1665 and spread through the summer with terrible efficiency. By September, the city was losing over 7,000 people per week. The king and his court fled to Oxford. The streets emptied. The Red Cross was painted on the doors of infected houses. Samuel Pepys, the great diarist of the era, walked through streets that had been emptied of sound, except for the death carts rolling slowly over cobblestones, the cry of "Bring out your dead" echoing off buildings whose windows were shuttered and dark. By the time the plague finally burned itself out in the winter of 1666, somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people had died. In a city of perhaps 450,000, that was roughly 1 in 5. And then on September 2nd, 1666, a fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Or so the story goes. The fire began in the early hours of the morning, in the heart of a city that was built almost entirely of timber framing, where buildings leaned so close together across narrow streets that neighbors could shake hands from their upper windows, in one of the driest summers in recorded English history. It spread for 4 days. By the time it was finally contained, it had destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, most of the medieval city of London, centuries of accumulated architecture, history, and culture, simply gone. Here is what makes the Great Fire permanently fascinating. The official explanation was always that it was an accident. A baker named Thomas Farriner claimed his oven had not been properly extinguished. The fire had spread on its own. But a French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire deliberately. He said he was part of a Catholic plot. He was convicted and executed. And then here is the part that rarely makes it into the standard history. It was subsequently discovered that Robert Hubert had not even arrived in England until 2 days after the fire started. He was almost certainly mentally ill. His confession was false. He was executed anyway. A monument was built to commemorate the fire. An inscription on its base explicitly blamed Catholics for starting it. That inscription remained for nearly 200 years, until it was removed in 1831 as part of Catholic emancipation. But for those 2 centuries, the official story in stone, in the heart of London, was that a Catholic conspiracy had burned the city down. The real cause of the fire has never been definitively established. What the fire did accomplish, whether or not it was an accident, was to remake London entirely. Christopher Wren designed the new St. Paul's Cathedral, along with 51 new city churches. The medieval timber city was replaced with brick and stone. The layout of the streets, the character of the architecture, the physical identity of London, all of it changed overnight. A catastrophe that destroyed almost everything somehow made London more itself, more permanent, more powerful. That is a pattern you will see over and over again in this city's history. In the autumn of 1888, in a small cluster of streets in the East End of London, a killer operated for 10 weeks and then vanished so completely that his identity has never been established. We know him as Jack the Ripper. The area was Whitehall. By 1888, the East End of London had become one of the most densely populated and desperately poor places in the industrial world. Hundreds of thousands of people, Irish immigrants, Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, the rural poor driven into the city by agricultural depression, packed into streets that had been designed for a fraction of their number. Single rooms housed entire families. Prostitution was not a choice for many of the women in Whitehall, it was survival. The canonical victims, the 5 women most historians agree were killed by the same hand, were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All were women living at the margins of Victorian society. All were murdered between August and November 1888. The manner of the killings was what elevated them from horrific to legendary. The killer worked quickly and precisely. Several of the victims showed evidence of surgical or at least anatomical knowledge, organs removed with skill in complete darkness, in open streets, without being heard or seen. Letters purportedly from the killer were sent to newspapers and to the police. Most were dismissed as hoaxes. One, sent with half a human kidney preserved in wine, may have been genuine. The kidney showed signs of Bright's disease consistent with the kidney removed from Catherine Eddowes. The police investigation was one of the largest London had ever seen, and it failed entirely. Over 100 suspects have been proposed in the century and more since: a Polish barber, a Russian doctor, a member of the royal family, a Freemason, a woman. The letters have been analyzed, the wounds have been re-examined, DNA has been extracted from envelope flaps. Nothing definitive has ever emerged. Jack the Ripper's power as a cultural phenomenon is not really about the murders themselves, terrible as they were. It is about what the murders revealed. They pulled back the curtain on the East End of London and forced the comfortable classes, for the first time, to look at what the empire they were so proud of had built in its own backyard. Poverty so extreme that women sold themselves on the street just to afford a bed for the night. Violence so normalized that neighbors heard screams and went back to sleep. The Ripper didn't just kill 5 women. He exposed a London that polite society had been very carefully not looking at for decades. And then he disappeared, and London looked away again. Before we talk about the London that people saw, let me tell you about the London that people tried not to see. In the 1840s and 1850s, there were areas of central London so dangerous, so disease-ridden, and so utterly beyond the reach of law or basic sanitation that they were given a special name. They were called rookeries. St. Giles, right in the heart of what is now the West End, minutes from the British Museum, was one of the worst. An estimated 54,000 people lived in a space that might reasonably have housed 5,000. Whole families existed in single rooms. Buildings shared walls with the ruins of collapsed buildings. Raw sewage ran through the streets. The River Fleet, one of London's buried rivers, had become an open sewer so toxic that fish were found dead for miles downstream. The Thames itself, the great river at the heart of the city, had become essentially an open cesspit. In 1858, the summer was so hot, and the river so full of human waste that the smell became genuinely unbearable, even in the Houses of Parliament, which sit right on the bank. Members of Parliament soaked the curtains in chloride of lime trying to cut the stench. They called it the Great Stink. And the Great Stink accomplished something that years of campaigning had failed to do. It forced the government to act. Joseph Bazalgette, a Victorian civil engineer of remarkable vision, designed a sewer system for London that remains one of the greatest feats of civil engineering in history. 1,100 miles of street sewers feeding into 82 miles of main interceptor sewers, all running at a careful gradient, all engineered so precisely that they still function today, still carrying London's waste, 160 years after they were built. Bazalgette also built the embankment along the north side of the Thames, reclaiming land from the river, hiding the new sewer pipes inside it, and in doing so creating one of the defining features of modern London's riverscape. Beneath the streets he built, beneath the embankment and the sewer tunnels and the later layers of the Underground Railway, London accumulated an extraordinary underworld, a literal hidden city. There are rivers under London that most Londoners have never seen: the Fleet, the Westbourne, which passes through a visible iron pipe inside Sloane Square Tube Station, the Walbrook, sacred to the Romans, now entirely buried, the Tyburn, the Effra, a dozen smaller streams, all absorbed by the growing city, all now flowing through Victorian brick culverts far underground. There are also tunnels, military tunnels from the Second World War that have been partially opened to the public and partially sealed, telephone exchange bunkers built to survive nuclear attack, a private railway, the Mail Rail, that ran entirely underground for over a century, carrying post across London without ever touching a public street. And there are still sections of tunnel, still rooms, still spaces under London that are on no public map, and that the people in authority decline to discuss in specific terms. London has always had two layers, the one they show you and the one they don't. On September 7, 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched the first of what would become 57 consecutive nights of bombing raids on London. The Blitz, as it became known, was designed to destroy the city's will to resist. Hermann Goering believed that sustained aerial bombardment would break civilian morale, force the government to negotiate, and deliver Britain into German hands without the need for a ground invasion. He was wrong. Over the next 8 months, the Luftwaffe dropped over 30,000 tons of high explosives on London. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. St. Paul's Cathedral was surrounded by fire on all sides. The image of its dome rising through the smoke became one of the defining images of the war. More than 40,000 civilians were killed. 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed. And London did not break. People sheltered in underground stations, sleeping on the platforms and the escalators and the tunnels while bombs fell above them. The government organized an evacuation of hundreds of thousands of children to the countryside. Winston Churchill walked through the rubble of bombed streets, making the V sign, giving speeches that became legendary. But there was another London operating beneath all of this, a secret London. Deep beneath Whitehall, in a basement complex that had been reinforced against bomb damage, Churchill and his war cabinet met, planned, and directed the entire Allied war effort. The cabinet war rooms, now open to the public as the Churchill War Rooms Museum, give you some sense of what it was like. The cramped offices, the map rooms covered in pins, the narrow beds, the telephone exchanges. But the war rooms are not the whole story. Beneath them and beneath other parts of central London, there are deeper complexes, tunnels built at a level that could survive direct bomb hits. Tunnel Q, which ran from the cabinet war rooms to various government departments. Deep-level shelters built under 8 tube stations, capable of housing 8,000 people each. A complex of tunnels beneath Whitehall so extensive that they have their own internal road system, wide enough for vehicles. Most of these tunnels still exist. Most are not open to the public. Some are used for storage. Some have been converted for other government purposes. Some are described in official documents only in the most general terms. In 2008, a tunnel entrance was discovered during construction work near the old Admiralty building that was not on any publicly available map. It led to a series of rooms that had clearly been in active use during the war and then sealed. What was in those rooms, what specific operations were run from them, has not been made fully public. London has been hiding things for 2,000 years. The Romans buried their temples. The Tudors buried their victims. The Victorians buried their rivers. The wartime government buried its secrets. The habit runs deep. Under Platform 9 at Liverpool Street Station, there is a plague pit. This is not a metaphor. When the Elizabeth Line was being constructed, the project formerly known as Crossrail, engineers drilling beneath Liverpool Street encountered human remains at a depth consistent with 17th-century plague burials. They found over 3,000 individual sets of remains, 3,000 people, buried in a mass grave beneath what is now one of the busiest train stations in Europe, from the Great Plague of 1665. Work continued around them. The project had schedules to keep. Under the City of London, the original Roman Forum, the largest civic building in the Roman Empire north of the Alps, lies in pieces beneath the streets. Parts of it have been excavated. Parts of it are accessible through basement car parks and the basements of office buildings, if you know where to look. Parts of it are simply underground, unexcavated, waiting. The Temple of Mithras, a Roman mystery cult whose rituals were so secret that we still don't fully understand them, was discovered in 1954 during post-war reconstruction of a bombed site in the City of London. It was dismantled and relocated. In 2017, when the Bloomberg building was completed on the original site, the temple was reconstructed in its original position, in the basement, at its original depth below street level. You can visit it. You can stand in the footprint of a Roman temple, built 1700 years ago, for a cult whose mysteries were so closely guarded that Roman members were sworn to reveal nothing, that Roman emperors tried to suppress, that survived underground, literally underground, for 2 millennia. London has a bone church. The crypt of St. Bride's on Fleet Street contains the bones of thousands of parishioners, neatly stacked in a small ossuary beneath the building. The church itself has stood on this site since the 6th century AD. It has been rebuilt 6 times. The bones go back centuries. The lost rivers still flow. You can hear the Westbourne through a pipe in Sloane Square Tube Station. You can sometimes hear the Fleet, particularly around Farringdon, if you stand in the right place and the street is quiet enough and you press your ear to a grate in the pavement. A ghost of a river, moving through Victorian brick in the dark, 100 feet below the city that forgot it. And there are things London has not forgotten, things the city carries forward with every generation, embedded in the streets themselves. The names of roads that tell you what used to be there: Pudding Lane, where the Great Fire started; Mincing Lane, where spices were once traded; Cheapside, from the Old English word for market. The way the streets in the oldest parts of the City of London still follow the line of Roman roads, 2,000 years later, because the ground remembers where the weight was put. London is not a city that was built and then remained. It is a city that has been burning and rebuilding, flooding and draining, dying and coming back for 2,000 years. Every catastrophe left a layer. Every rebuilding left a scar. Every generation added something and buried something, and the city just kept going, deeper and darker, and more densely layered with history than any place on earth has a right to be. That marsh the Celts thought was sacred, those Roman walls Alfred used to shelter behind, the ash of Boudicca's fire still pressed into the ground, the plague dead stacked in careful rows under the financial district, the heads on the bridge, the smoke from the fire, the bodies in Whitehall, the bombs falling on Southwark and Stepney and the docks. All of it is still there, under the buses and the tourists and the coffee shops and the markets, under the Thames, which is still sacred to something, even if we've forgotten what. London is not just history. London is a city that has refused to die so many times that refusing to die has become its defining characteristic, its personality, its reason for being. And if you put your ear to the ground, in the right place, at the right time of night, when the streets are quiet and the traffic has thinned, you can still hear it breathing. That is the story of London, 2,000 years of fire and plague and conquest and survival. The Romans, the Vikings, the Normans, the Tudors, the plagues and the fires and the bombs and the serial killers and the secret tunnels and the rivers that nobody talks about anymore. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely, thank you. This took an enormous amount of research and I put everything I had into it. Now I need something from you. Subscribe if you haven't already. This channel goes deep on history, not the sanitized version, not the textbook version, but the real version, the version they didn't want to put in school. Hit the bell so you get notified every time we drop a new video. And leave me a comment right now. Tell me which era of London's history shocked you the most. Was it the Roman invasion, the plague pits under the tube stations, Jack the Ripper, the secret wartime tunnels, or was it something else, something you're going to spend the next 3 hours researching because this video sent you down a rabbit hole you can't get out of? Because that is exactly what this channel is supposed to do.